Bennett Ravenscroft looked Audrey in the eye and told her she was done being useful to him as anything other than a bargaining chip. Those were his exact words. Bargaining chip. She had spent 14 years inside that man's house, eaten at his table, grieved at his side, grown up under his protection, and in 60 seconds he reduced every single one of those years to a transaction. He stood there in his perfectly pressed suit, voice flat, expression locked, and told her she was being engaged to Tristan Pembroke. Effective immediately. No negotiation. Audrey was 22 years old and had nowhere to run that Bennett didn't already own. What she didn't know yet, what would take her months and a near-death experience to uncover, was that the cruelest thing Bennett ever did to her was also the only way he knew how to love her. But we'll get there. If you've ever trusted someone completely, only to feel that trust shatter in a single conversation, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way through, because I promise you, nothing here is what it first appears to be. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your city and country, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. And let's begin. The morning it all came apart, Audrey Whitcomb was doing something completely ordinary. She was standing in the kitchen of the Croft estate at 6:45 in the morning, pouring herself coffee. She didn't actually want, watching rain collect in the garden through the tall windows, and trying to convince herself that the knot behind her sternum was just anxiety and not instinct. She had been waking up with that knot for 3 weeks. She hadn't told anyone, not Bennett's housekeeper, Margaret, who noticed everything and kept most of it to herself. Not Graham Sedgwick, Bennett's lieutenant, who had been a steady and neutral presence in Audrey's life since she was 9 years old. Definitely not Bennett himself, who had been colder than usual lately, more deliberate, more distracted, the kind of controlled that meant something was being managed. Audrey knew Bennett Ravenscroft better than she knew almost anyone. She had grown up watching the way his jaw tightened when he was making a calculation he didn't like. She knew the difference between the silence he used when he was thinking and the silence he's used when he had already decided and was simply waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Lately it had been the second kind. She told herself she was imagining it. She poured the coffee down the drain, left the mug on the counter, and went upstairs to get dressed. She did not see Bennett come in through the side entrance. She did not see the brief exchange between him and Graham in the hall, two men who had known each other for 15 years, communicating in the shorthand of people who have survived too much together. She did not see the way Graham looked at the floor when it was over, which was something Graham almost never did. She was upstairs, pulling on her jacket, telling herself the knot was nothing. Bennett called her into his study at 9 o'clock. That was not unusual. The study was where Bennett handled nearly everything: phone calls, documents, the quiet and brutal business of running an empire that operated in the space between what was legal and what was simply not yet prosecuted. Audrey had sat across from that desk hundreds of times over the years. As a child, she had done her homework on the leather couch near the window while he worked. As a teenager, she had argued with him in that room about curfews and schools and the limits of his authority over her life. As an adult, as whatever she had become to him. In the last 2 years, she had stood at that window with him, late at night, close enough to feel the warmth off his sleeve, talking about things she hadn't talked about with anyone else. So she walked in without hesitating. She sat down across from the desk and immediately understood that something was wrong. Bennett was standing, not seated. That was the first thing. He was standing at the far side of the desk, with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture he used in boardrooms, not with her. He was wearing his full suit at 9 in the morning, jacket buttoned, tie precise, every single detail assembled and locked into place. He looked the way he looked when he was presenting something to a rival family. Audrey folded her hands in her lap and waited. "I have something to tell you," he said. "All right. It's been decided that you'll be formally introduced to Tristan Pembroke this weekend. There will be a dinner at the Lancaster in Manhattan. After that, assuming everything proceeds appropriately, an engagement will be announced." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a very high place. Audrey sat completely still. "I'm sorry," she said. "An engagement? Yes, between me and Tristan Pembroke." here to the Pembroke organization. You've heard me mention his father, Douglas. I've heard you mention his father. Her voice was careful, measured, the way she had learned to be in rooms where losing control of your expression cost you something. I've also heard you mention that Tristan Pembroke has been photographed with 7 different women in the last 18 months, and that his family has been quietly managing a reputation problem for the better part of 3 years. That's accurate, and you want me to marry him. Bennett held her gaze. His eyes were the color of slate after rain, and right now there was nothing in them that she recognized. The Pembroke Alliance provides access to European shipping infrastructure that the Ravenscroft network has been working toward for over a decade. The Wycliffe organization has been positioning to acquire those same ports. If Pembroke aligns with Wycliffe instead, Bennett, she said his name the way she only said it when she needed him to stop talking like a CEO and remember who he was talking to. Why me? A pause. Because the Pembrokes will not negotiate with someone they don't trust personally. Tristan is 31 years old and needs a wife. His family considers appropriate. You have been part of the Ravenscroft household for 14 years. You are educated, you are composed, and you understand how this world operates. I am 22, yes. I am 22 years old, and you are describing me like I am an asset to be deployed. Something flickered across his face. It was there for less than a second, and then it was gone. You are no longer a child, he said. It's time you made yourself useful to the family. She heard it. Made yourself useful. Every memory she had of the last 2 years, every late night, every honest conversation, every moment when she had believed, genuinely believed, that what existed between them was something that could not be reduced to household dynamics or power structures, all of it rearranged itself in the space of that sentence. She stood up. Was I a bargaining chip? She asked. The whole time. Was that what I was? It wasn't quite a question by the end of it. Bennett looked at her across the desk and said, You should start thinking about what you want to bring to Manhattan this weekend. Audrey walked out of the study. She did not run. She was not going to run. She walked down the hallway with her shoulders level and her chin up, the way she had walked through every hard thing in this house since she was 8 years old, and learning that grief had to be carried quietly if you wanted to be taken seriously. She went up the stairs, into her room, and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. The knot behind her sternum had not been anxiety. It had been instinct. She had been right all along, which was somehow the worst part. She did not speak to Bennett for the rest of that day. She did not go down for dinner. She did not answer when Margaret knocked at 7:30 to ask if she needed anything. She lay on top of the covers in the dark, with her phone face down on the nightstand, and went through the last 2 years like someone going through a drawer looking for something they swore they had put somewhere safe. She found nothing that contradicted him. That was the honest truth, and it was brutal. She looked for evidence that she had been foolish, that she had misread everything, and she found enough of it to feel sick. The late nights that ended with his hand, briefly, on her shoulder before he stepped away. The dinners that stretched past midnight because neither of them moved to end the conversation. The night his phone had rung 3 times while they were talking, and he had silenced it each time without looking at the screen, which was something she had never seen Bennett Ravenscroft do for anyone. She had constructed a story from those moments. The story was apparently wrong. She turned onto her side and stared at the far wall and told herself that this was survivable. She had survived losing her parents at 8. She had survived 7 different schools before Bennett settled on the right one. She had survived being the girl who lived in the criminal empire's house and didn't quite fit anywhere else outside of it. She could survive being wrong about a man, even if the man was him. The dinner at the Lancaster happened on a Saturday. Tristan Pembroke was handsome in the way that men who had always been photographed were handsome, practiced, maintained, aware of the angle. He stood when Audrey entered the private dining room, which was technically a courtesy and practically a performance. He had dark hair, an expensive watch, and a smile that arrived slightly before his eyes did. Audrey, he said, as though they were already on familiar terms. You're exactly as described. She held out her hand to shake. He turned it and brought her knuckles toward his mouth. I'm Audrey Whitcomb, she said, not pulling her hand back but letting the flatness of her tone do the work. I prefer a handshake. Something amused shifted through his expression. He accepted correction without embarrassment, which was either confidence or the practiced performance of it. Bennett was across the table to her left. She did not look at him. Dinner was long and carefully managed. Douglas Pembroke, Tristan's father, was 63, methodical, and spoke mostly about port logistics and transit windows. His wife, Catherine, asked Audrey polite questions about her education and upbringing and received very polite answers in return. Tristan watched Audrey the way someone watched a new acquisition assessing value, finding edges, determining what leverage looked like. Once, he reached across the table to refill her wine glass without asking. She moved the glass herself before he could reach it. I've got it, she said pleasantly. She looked at Bennett. He was looking at his phone. She poured her own wine. The dinner ended at 10:30 with handshakes and the understanding that things were moving forward. In the elevator on the way down, Tristan stood close enough that their arms nearly touched and said, "You're going to be interesting, Audrey." "I hope that's not a problem," she said. The opposite. He tilted his head. "I've been engaged twice before. Both women were very easy. I didn't respect either of them." She looked straight ahead at the elevator doors. "I'll try to maintain my standards then." He laughed. Bennett said nothing. She found him the next morning. She had intended to sleep on it to give herself time to construct an argument that was clear and unemotional, because she knew from years of watching Bennett operate that the only way to reach him was to be precise. Emotion, in that man's world, was a variable to be managed. If she came at him angry, he would redirect it. If she came at him hurt, he would use patience as a weapon. She had planned to wait. She did not wait. She pushed open the door of his study without knocking, which was something she had earned the right to do years ago, and she found him standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the garden. "We need to talk about last night," she said. "The dinner went well. Tristan Pembroke treated me like something being previewed at an auction, and you didn't say a single word. You handled yourself. I shouldn't have had to handle myself. You put me in that room." He turned from the window. His face was composed in the way it always was, that particular stillness he could manufacture at will, but there was something underneath it, something that pressed at the surface of his expression without quite breaking through. "You did more than handle yourself," he said. "You set terms without being asked. You held position without being coached. The Pembrokes are going to respect you. Respect me." She crossed the room until she was close enough that he would have to look at her without the distance of the window between them. "I care whether you just told me, 14 years after I came to live in this house, that I am nothing more than a tool you've been maintaining for eventual use." The muscle at the edge of his jaw tightened. "Audrey, was any of it real?" She said it quietly, not with anger, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a question for days and finally put it down. "I need you to tell me the truth. I am not a child. I am not going to break, but I need to know whether I imagined everything or whether you made a decision to override it." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Then you didn't imagine it." The room got very quiet. "But it doesn't change anything," he said. "You will go to Manhattan. You will meet with Tristan's family. The engagement will proceed." She took a breath through her nose. Slow, controlled. "So I didn't imagine it," she said. "You felt something real, and you are doing it anyway. You are handing me to another man anyway. I am protecting this family. I am not a Ravenscroft. I was never formally a Ravenscroft. You have been my guardian, Bennett, and in 2 years we became something that I—" She stopped. "Reset. I am telling you that I don't want this. That should mean something to you." "It does mean something to me." "Then why—" "Because what I want is not the only variable." His voice came out with a rough edge, the first crack in the composure, and she watched him hear it and pull it back under control. "You are 22 years old, and you are living inside an organization that has enemies. Serious enemies. People who have been looking for the right leverage to use against me for years. As long as you are in this house, as long as what we—" He stopped. His jaw tightened again. "As long as there is a visible attachment, you are a target. The Wycliffe organization has already made inquiries. Inquiries about me. about my vulnerabilities. The word hit her differently than he probably intended. Vulnerabilities. He had just called her his vulnerability. She didn't know whether to be devastated or furious or something else entirely. Some third emotion she didn't have a name for yet. So the engagement protects me, she said slowly. It removes you from the equation. By putting me in a different equation, with a family that can protect you independently of my organization. She stood there and looked at him. He stood there and looked back at her. And she understood in that moment that he believed every word he was saying. He had constructed a logic, as he constructed all of his logics, that accounted for every variable except the most important one, that she was a person and not a position on a board. She said, "I'll go to the engagement dinner." Something in his face shifted relief, she thought, or the controlled version of it. "But I am going on my terms," she said, "not yours." The engagement celebration was held at the Pembroke family's penthouse 3 weeks later. 300 guests, politicians, executives, the kind of faces that appeared on the backs of gallery donations and in the footnotes of Senate hearings. And scattered throughout, quiet and well-dressed and very careful about where they stood relative to the exits. The people who made up the actual reason any of this mattered. Audrey wore a dark emerald gown she had chosen herself, from a designer she had chosen herself, with a necklace that had belonged to her mother. A sound like green wood splitting. She had spent an hour in front of the mirror that afternoon, making sure that the woman looking back at her was someone she recognized. She found Tristan before dinner and asked for 20 minutes in private. He was surprised. He agreed. She did not waste the 20 minutes. "I'll marry you," she said. He blinked. "I assumed that was already—" "I'm renegotiating the terms." "Sit down," he sat. She stood. "I will marry you. I will be a Pembroke wife in every public capacity. I'll sit as your family's position, assist in the European port negotiations, and manage your reputation with the particular competence that comes from having grown up inside 2 criminal dynasties and never once ended up in a newspaper. You can continue living your personal life however you see fit, Tristan. I have zero interest in your other arrangements." He was watching her with the focused attention of someone who had underestimated a situation and was recalibrating. "One condition," she said, "non-negotiable. Our marriage will exist on paper. You will never have the right to touch me without my explicit and enthusiastic consent. You try to override that condition, and I will make your reputation problem look like a footnote." A long beat of silence. Then Tristan Pembroke did something she hadn't expected. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Deal." She nodded once. "Good. Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. You're not doing this for the Pembrokes." "No," she said. "And you're not doing it for Bennett Ravenscroft." She looked at him steadily. "I'm doing it for me," she said. For the first time in a very long time. Tristan studied her for a moment longer, then stood, straightened his jacket, and held out his hand. She shook it, properly this time. "I have a feeling," he said, "that this is going to be the best arrangement of my adult life." "Don't push it," she said. He almost smiled. At the reception, standing near the long windows overlooking the city, Audrey felt the shift in the room that always preceded Bennett Ravenscroft entering a space. She did not turn around. She watched the city lights and held her champagne glass and kept her face neutral. He appeared at her periphery. "You look well," he said. "Thank you. I heard you spoke with Tristan privately." "I did. Is there anything—" "I'm announcing to the family tomorrow that I'll be moving out of the estate," she said. "I've found an apartment in the West 70s. It's time I had my own place." She felt him go still beside her. "I'm 22 years old, Bennett." "You said so yourself. It's time I made myself useful." She paused, letting the words land exactly where she intended them to. "Besides, won't Camille Lockwood need the space? Margaret mentioned you've been speaking with her." "She seems lovely." She finally turned and looked at him. His face was doing the thing it did when something he had not accounted for entered the equation. The controlled surface held, but underneath it, just for a second, was something raw and completely exposed. Then he put it away. "I'll have Graham arrange for your things to be packed," he said. "I can arrange my own things," she said pleasantly. "Thank you." She turned back to the window. Behind her, she heard him set his glass down on a passing tray and walk away. She watched the city. She told herself she was fine. She almost believed it. Later that night, past 2 in the morning, the apartment she hadn't yet moved into still empty and quiet. She sat in her car in the parking structure beneath the estate because she wasn't ready to go back upstairs yet, and she wasn't ready to drive anywhere else either. She sat in the dark and breathed. She had done the right thing. She believed that. She had negotiated herself a marriage on her terms, a roof over her head, and an exit from a dynamic that had been consuming her without her permission for 2 years. She was being smart. She was being the woman who grew up inside that world and learned to operate inside it without being swallowed by it. She was fine. The car window fogged slightly. Outside, the estate was quiet. Somewhere above her, she was fairly certain, Bennett Ravenscroft was either working or doing a very controlled impression of it. She put her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. She thought about the moment in the study when he had said, "You didn't imagine it." She thought about the muscle at his jaw, the rough edge in his voice before he pulled it back under. The way he had looked at her across the Lancasters' dining table and then looked at his phone instead. You didn't imagine it. He had felt something real, and he was handing her to another man anyway. She opened her eyes. The parking structure was gray and cold and ugly. She started the car. She had a week to pack. She had a new apartment to move into. She had an engagement to maintain on her own terms, and a whole portion of her life to construct from scratch in the image of someone who did not need anyone's permission to exist. She pulled out of the parking space. She drove. She did not look back at the estate in the rearview mirror. That at least she managed. Audrey moved out on a Tuesday. She had expected it to feel like escape. She had been telling herself for a week that it would feel like escape, that the moment she cleared the last box out of her room at the Ravenscroft estate and closed the door behind her, something would lift. Some pressure that had been sitting on her chest for months would finally release, and she would drive away from that house and feel, for the first time in a long time, like herself. It did not feel like escape. It felt like amputation. She had lived in that house for 14 years. She knew every sound it made at night, every draft that came through the third-floor hallway in winter, every crack in the ceiling of the east sitting room, that which she had spent hundreds of hours staring at while Bennett worked at his desk, and the world outside moved around them in its complicated, dangerous way. The house was not home. She understood that now with a clarity that was almost clinical. But it was the closest thing she had ever had to one, and leaving it with 3 boxes and a carry-on felt like cutting something off that had grown into her. Margaret stood at the bottom of the steps when Audrey brought the last box out. She didn't say anything for a moment, just watched. Then you forgot your mother's photograph, the one by the bathroom window. "I know," Audrey said. "I left it." Margaret's expression shifted in a way that she immediately controlled. "You left it. I'll get it later." She wouldn't. She knew she wouldn't. But she couldn't explain to Margaret, who had never once in 15 years of service shown any open sentiment, that taking the photograph meant she was actually leaving, and she wasn't ready to make that true yet. She put the box in the trunk. She drove to the West 70s. The apartment was good. Objectively good 2 bedrooms, high ceilings, enough natural light that she wouldn't go insane by February. She had chosen it herself, which mattered, even if the choosing had happened in a 20-minute window while she was running on 3 hours of sleep and 4 cups of coffee. She set up her bed frame that afternoon without asking for help, stripped the skin off 3 knuckles with a wrench, said something extremely uncharacteristic, and moved on. By evening, she had a bed and a coffee maker and a clear view of the street 7 floors down. She stood at the window with a mug and told herself it was enough. Her phone buzzed. "Tristan, family dinner Friday. My mother wants you there. Can you make it work?" She wrote back, "I'll be there." She put the phone face down. She looked at the street. Below her, a dark car was parked at the corner with its engine running. She noticed it, the way she noticed most things in most streets, the reflex that came from growing up inside an organization that understood the value of what you saw before you were supposed to see it. The car was too still, had been there since before she arrived. She watched it for 10 minutes. It didn't move. She pulled the curtain halfway and went to make dinner. 3 days into the apartment, she found the first one. She had been reorganizing the kitchen. One of the cabinets didn't make sense the way it had been set up before she moved in, and she was adjusting the shelving when she noticed the discoloration near the back wall. A faint line in the paint, precise and rectangular, and very small, where someone had removed something that had been fixed into place for a while and patched it afterward. She knew what that was. She had grown up around surveillance equipment. She knew the size of the patch, the specific shade of off-white that didn't quite match, the exact shape that a small camera housing left behind when it was removed. Except this one hadn't been removed. She found the lens when she moved the spice rack. It was off, disconnected, no signal, no power, but it had been there, installed before she moved in, and someone had disabled it recently. Recently enough that the disconnect was clean, no damage, just switched off. She sat back on the kitchen floor. She looked at the ceiling. "Bennett," she said to the empty apartment, quietly. Not a question. She got up. She checked the rest of the kitchen, then the living room, then the hallway. She found 2 more, both disabled, both recent, both installed with the specific technical precision that came from using people who actually knew what they were doing, not the off-the-shelf kind. She did not call him. She sat on the kitchen floor for a while longer and breathed. She was not going to call him. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of being caught and still being the one she reached for. She picked herself up, washed her hands, and called Graham Sedgwick instead. Graham answered on the second ring. "The apartment," she said. He set up the apartment, a pause. Not the kind that meant Graham didn't know. The kind that meant he was deciding how much honesty the situation called for. "He made some arrangements," Graham said. "How many cameras?" The security system was comprehensive. "How many cameras, Graham?" Another pause. 6. She closed her eyes. "Is anyone watching the feeds?" "He shut them down the day you moved in. He shut them down. Every one of them. Remotely. I was in the room when he did it. A beep. He said you'd find them. He knew I'd find them. He counted on it." She stood very still in her kitchen. That is so deeply infuriating, and I don't even is the building." "He owns the building, Audrey." The sentence arrived like a flat hand against a table. She said nothing for a long time. "He purchased it 14 months ago," Graham said, and now his voice had shifted into something quieter, something that on Graham Sedgwick was the closest approximation to discomfort. "Registered under a holding company. He had the elevator security upgraded, the emergency exits redesigned, the lobby camera system replaced. He has 2 people in the building. They rotate. You won't see them unless something happens." 14 months ago, she repeated. "Yes, before any of this." Before any of this. She pressed the heel of her hand against the edge of the counter. Hard, the pressure helped her think. "So he arranged a place for me to be independent and surveilled me the entire time, and then disabled the surveillance the moment I actually moved in." That's an accurate summary. And the car on the corner, a pause that confirmed it without requiring words. "I want to be very angry right now," she said. "That seems reasonable." "And I am angry," she breathed, "but Graham." "Why did he disable them?" Graham was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the careful neutral of a man who had spent decades watching. 2 people refused to say the obvious thing. "He said you'd earned the privacy." She didn't answer. "Audrey, don't," she said. "Don't do the thing where you make me feel something about this." "I can't right now. I'm not doing anything. You're doing your voice." "I don't have a voice." "You have exactly one voice, Graham, and you're doing it, and I need you to stop." She heard him exhale the long, controlled kind that meant he was managing his own response. "The car will be gone by tomorrow morning, if you want it gone." "I want it gone," she said immediately. "Then leave the people in the building." She hung up before Graham could respond. She put the phone on the counter. She stood in the kitchen of an apartment that Bennett Ravenscroft had purchased and secured and wired, and then silently surrendered. The moment she actually stepped into it, screen splitting, and she pressed both palms flat against the counter and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do with a man like that. She came up with nothing useful. She started cooking. The Pembroke family dinner was held at a brownstone in the 60s that Catherine Pembroke had been decorating for 30 years with the specific confidence of a woman who had never once considered whether a taste might be wrong. There were 12 people at the table. Audrey knew 4 of them by name, 2 more by reputation, and the remaining 6 by the particular way. Wealthy criminal families placed their people around a table family at the center, trusted associates at the margins, and 1 or 2 individuals positioned at a specific distance from the exits who were there to observe rather than participate. She sat beside Tristan. He poured her water without fanfare, which she appreciated. He didn't try to make conversation the way nervous people didn't fill the silences with performative ease. He was composed and watchful in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of Bennett, except that where Bennett's watchfulness came from a place of genuine calculation, Tristan's felt more like habit. The habit of a man who had spent his whole life at tables like this and had learned to survive them without revealing too much. Catherine Pembroke asked Audrey about her upbringing. Audrey answered simply, orphaned at 8, raised in the Ravenscroft household, educated privately. She answered the way she had learned to answer enough detail to satisfy, not enough to invite excavation. Bennett Ravenscroft has always spoken highly of you, Douglas said from the head of the table. He had the practiced warmth of a man who understood the value of appearing approachable. He's been very protective of this arrangement. He would be, Audrey said pleasantly. You've known him a long time. Most of my life. Douglas nodded, something considering moving through his expression. He's a complicated man. Most men in his position are, she said. Across the table, one of the observing figures, a man named Harlan, who she'd quietly identified as Douglas Pembroke's head of security, was watching her with the specific attention of someone running calculations. She met his gaze briefly, then returned to her water glass. After dinner, Catherine walked her through the ground floor to show her the house. It was the kind of tour that was not about the house. Audrey accepted it graciously and listened to what was being communicated between the sentences. The Pembrokes needed this alliance, more than they were showing. Whatever the European port situation was, and she had only the outline of it from Bennett's study and Tristan's careful non-statements, the Pembroke organization was under pressure that went beyond reputation management. They needed the Ravenscroft network's endorsement as much as they needed the European contracts, possibly more. Which meant Audrey had more leverage here than anyone had told her. She filed that away. On the way out, Tristan walked her to the car. You handled my mother beautifully, he said. I wasn't handling her. No, he said, and there was something almost respectful in his tone. You weren't. That's what I mean. He paused with his hand on the door. Harlan thinks you're a plant. A plant. Bennett's intelligence asset, positioned inside our family to monitor the alliance from within. She held his gaze. Is that what you think? Tristan considered it. I think you're exactly what you said you are. Someone making the best available move with the cards she was dealt. And if Harlan brings that concern to your father, then you and I have a problem. His voice didn't change, it stayed even, almost casual, but his eyes were direct. I want you to know that in advance, not as a threat. As information, she nodded once. I appreciate the transparency. Don't get used to it. He opened the car door. I'm not usually this candid with women I'm about to marry. High bar, she said. She got in the car. She told herself she would not look for evidence. She told herself for approximately 48 hours, during which time she reorganized her new apartment twice, started and abandoned a book, and went for 3 runs that were each longer than the last, and progressively less about fitness. She told herself she was done excavating the mechanics of whatever Bennett had constructed around her life without her permission. She had the information. She understood it. She was moving forward. Then the meals started arriving. Not every day, every few days. No note, no return address, handed to the front desk by a delivery service she'd never used and couldn't trace past a third-party handling company. The first time, a container of Thai food she hadn't ordered, and she almost sent it back before she opened the lid and registered what was in it. No garlic. Every single dish. No garlic. Specifically and deliberately constructed for the one person in the city who had a genuine physical aversion to garlic not an allergy, nothing dangerous, just a sensitivity she'd had since childhood that made certain foods unpleasant, and that she had mentioned once, casually years ago, in a kitchen conversation she hadn't even been sure Bennett had been paying attention to. He had been paying attention. She sat on her kitchen floor for the second time in a week. She ate the Thai food. She did not thank him. She did not contact him. But she ate every bite. Graham called her on a Thursday morning, 11 days after she'd moved out. She was in the middle of getting dressed, so she answered with one hand and pressed the phone between her ear and shoulder, which was something Bennett had always hated. Watching people do, he found it inefficient, which had always seemed to her like a very specific kind of wrong priority. "We have a situation," Graham said, not the voice he used for minor situations. She put down the jacket. "Tell me." "The Wycliffe organization has made contact with the Pembrokes." She was quiet. Specifically, Graham said, "Sterling Wycliffe has indicated interest in a direct conversation with Douglas about the European port contracts. He's framing it as an alternative to the Ravenscroft alliance. He's offering them a better deal. He's offering them a cleaner one. No complicated personal arrangements, no history, no a pause, no variables." She understood what variables meant in that sentence. "Does Bennett know?" "Bennett was informed this morning." "How did he take it?" Graham's pause was answer enough. She picked up the jacket. "What does this do to the engagement?" "Nothing yet. The Pembrokes haven't responded to Wycliffe. But Harlan has been pushing Douglas for 2 weeks to consider the Wycliffe approach. If Douglas meets with Sterling, the engagement falls apart. The alliance falls apart. And Bennett is left exposed to the Wycliffe network with less collateral than he started with. That's the shape of it." She pulled on the jacket. "Does Bennett want me to do something?" "No." Graham said it immediately, which meant Bennett had specifically said not to involve her, which meant Graham was calling her in direct contradiction of Bennett's instruction, which was not something Graham did lightly. "He doesn't know I'm calling." "Graham." "The Wycliffe contact with the Pembrokes isn't just a business approach," Graham said. His voice had shifted into something lower, more careful. "Sterling has been gathering information on the Ravenscroft operation for 8 months. Specific information, the kind that doesn't come from public records or competitor intelligence." She stopped moving. "He has an inside source," she said. "That's what the evidence suggests. In the Ravenscroft organization. Or adjacent to it." She thought about the word adjacent for several seconds. "How close to Bennett?" she said. "We don't know yet." She sat down on the edge of her bed, and Bennett is handling it internally, quietly, the way he handles everything, a beat. The problem is that Sterling knows things about the Ravenscroft network's vulnerabilities that only someone in a position of genuine trust would know. She heard the thing underneath that sentence. "Graham," she said slowly, "what specifically does Sterling know?" Another pause. "Longer. He knows about you," Graham said, not in a general sense. "Specifically, the apartment, the building, the security arrangements, the food deliveries." A quiet beat that felt like something being carefully set down on a table. "He has been watching you, Audrey, carefully, for a while." The room was very quiet, and Bennett knows this. "He does now, is that why he—" She stopped, rewound. "The cameras he disabled. He disabled them because leaving them active would confirm the relationship to whoever was watching." "That's my read," Graham said. She pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Thinking. "If Sterling knows about the apartment," she said, "then the engagement hasn't protected me. It's moved the location. He still knows I'm the variable." "Yes, and if Bennett knows that Sterling knows, then everything Bennett did to create distance between you has failed," Graham said. "Sterling doesn't believe it. He never believed it. He was simply watching to see what Bennett would do next." She stood up. She walked to the window. Below, the street was ordinary. 2 people with coffee, a cab idling, nothing that looked like anything. But she thought about 8 months of evidence gathering. She thought about the inside source. She thought about the word adjacent. She thought about Harlan. She thought about Tristan. "Sits," He had thought about the dinner table, and the way Douglas Pembroke had said, complicated man with the particular inflection of someone who already knew something they weren't disclosing. Graham, she said, I need you to find out how Sterling made contact with the Pembrokes. Audrey specifically who initiated the contact. Because if Sterling approached the Pembrokes, that's one thing. But if someone inside the Pembroke organization reached out to Sterling first, that's not your... That is exactly my situation, she said, and her voice came out with an edge she hadn't planned. I am engaged to Tristan Pembroke, and if the Pembrokes are actively facilitating a Wycliffe approach, then I am sitting inside a trap, and I need to know that now. Graham was quiet for a long moment. I'll find out, he said. Don't tell Bennett, I asked. A pause that communicated that Graham found this instruction extremely unreasonable. I'll find out, he said again. She went to see Bennett. She had not planned to. She had told herself she would give the information time to settle, would think it through carefully, would decide on an approach that was controlled and strategic and fueled, not specific brand, by the specific brand of cold fury she was currently operating on. She had intended all of that. She drove to the state at noon on a Friday. She did not call ahead. She went through the side entrance, nodded at the two men in the hall who had known her since she was 12, and said nothing because she was moving too deliberately for anyone to reasonably stop her, walked down the corridor, pushed open the study door, and stood in the doorway. Bennett was on the phone. He looked up. He finished his sentence something about documentation, a name she didn't recognize, and hung up. You knew Sterling was watching me, she said. He set the phone on the desk. His face was doing nothing. Come in and close the door. I'll ask from here, Audrey. You knew he had surveillance on the apartment, and you said nothing. Close the door. She closed the door. She did not move further into the room. How long? 3 weeks. You've known for 3 weeks that Sterling Wycliffe had eyes on my building, and you sent me food. Something crossed his face. Too fast to name. The deliveries were already arranged before. That's not the point, and you know it. She crossed her arms, not from defensiveness, but because it was the only physical option that didn't involve putting her hands somewhere she'd regret. The engagement was supposed to remove me from the equation. You told me that. Those were your exact words. And you have known for 3 weeks that it failed. That Sterling never bought it. That I am still... She stopped. What is your current plan, Bennett? Because from where I'm standing, I appear to be a piece on a board that you keep moving without telling me where I'm going. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window, the same window he always went to when he needed distance from the room, and stood with his back to her. The inside source is a problem, he said. I know. He turned. You talked to Graham. Graham called me. She held his gaze. Who is it? We don't have confirmation yet. Your best guess. His jaw tightened. A possibility I'm investigating. Name. The word hit the room like a key in a lock. Bennett looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she understood he was deciding something, not whether to tell her, but how to tell her in a way that didn't blow the investigation or compromise the 3 other things he was managing simultaneously. Harlan Voss, he said finally. She had been right. She didn't let herself react to that. Tristan's family security chief. He has had access to both organizations' communication channels for 18 months. He came out of the Wycliffe network originally, moved to the Pembrokes 6 years ago. We flagged the history when the alliance was first proposed. Douglas gave assurances. Douglas's assurances are worth what, exactly? Increasingly little, Bennett said. She let that sit for a moment. If Harlan is feeding information to Sterling, then Douglas either knows and is allowing it, or Harlan has gone independent and Douglas doesn't know, which is arguably worse for everyone. Yes. And Tristan? Bennett's expression shifted into something she couldn't quite read. Tristan is not the problem, he said, and the way he said it told her that he had already made this determination, already done the calculation, and that the conclusion had not been without its costs. She said, You investigated him. I investigate everyone. What did you find? He held her gaze, that he is genuinely trying to hold his family's position together with increasingly limited leverage, and that the arrangement he made with you, the terms you negotiated privately, is the only functional plan any of the involved parties have produced. She blinked. You know about the terms. I know you told him the marriage would exist on paper. How? Bennett said nothing. She closed her eyes briefly. Harlan, most likely. So Sterling knows those terms too. Almost certainly. She opened her eyes, which means Sterling knows I'm not actually inside the Pembroke family. I'm still unattached, still accessible, still the cleanest path to leverage against you. Yes, the word sat in the room between them. She looked at the man she had spent 14 years watching, operate this controlled, infuriating, meticulous man who had bought her building and disabled her cameras, and made sure her food contained no garlic, and refused, absolutely refused, to simply tell her what he felt. And she said, very quietly, Bennett, what are you planning? He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion under his composure, not the managed kind, the real kind, the kind that came from weeks of carrying something too heavy to put down. The port negotiations have been relocated, he said, to a waterfront complex outside Boston. In 3 weeks. Both families will be present. I am representing Ravenscroft interests. And me. The Pembrokes want you there as Tristan's representative. And you're going to let that happen. I'm going to be there, he said. That's what I can tell you. She searched his face. Bennett, I need you to trust me for 3 more weeks, he said. His voice had gone to a place she almost never heard, stripped of performance, stripped of control. Just the plain words of a man who understood he had very little standing to make this request. I know that is, I understand what I'm asking. She stared at him. 3 weeks, she said, yes. And then what? He held her gaze. And then I'm going to fix it, he said. All of it. She stood in his study and looked at the man who had built a fortress around her apartment and called her his vulnerability and told her she was a bargaining chip and sent her garlic-free Thai food at 9:30 on a Thursday night, and she tried to decide whether trust was still something she had left to give him. She did not decide. She walked out, but she did not say no. The engagement party announcement ran in 2 society columns and a financial publication the following Monday. Audrey Whitcomb, ward of the Ravenscroft family, engaged to Tristan Pembroke. Photographs from the penthouse celebration. Her in the emerald gown, Tristan beside her, both looking exactly as composed as 2 people who had privately redefined every term of the arrangement. She read the coverage over coffee in her apartment. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. Congratulations, Audrey. She didn't recognize the number. She had a feeling she knew who did. She set the phone down. She looked out the window at the ordinary street. Somewhere in a building she didn't officially know he owned, a man who had never once in all her memory said, I love you, was running 3 separate contingency plans to keep her alive, and she was engaged to another man on paper, and in 3 weeks, every piece of this would collide in a room in Boston, and nothing not her careful negotiation, not Bennett's meticulous preparation, not Tristan's unexpected decency was going to keep that from. The text came from a blocked number at 11:47 on a Sunday night. Audrey was still awake. She had been awake since 9, sitting at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen that was running out of ink, trying to map out what she actually knew versus what she was inferring, because the distinction mattered. The distinction mattered, and she had spent too many days letting the 2 categories bleed into each other. The legal pad had 3 columns. What she knew, what she suspected, what she couldn't account for. The 3rd column was the longest. Her phone buzzed against the table. She picked it up. The message was a photograph. She looked at it for a long time without fully processing what she was seeing, the way the brain sometimes refuses to assemble the pieces, because it already knows it won't like the picture. It was a photograph of Bennett, taken from a distance through what looked like a restaurant window. Grainy but clear enough. He was sitting across from a woman Audrey didn't recognize. Late 40s, well-dressed, dark hair. They were leaning toward each other in the specific geometry of a private conversation, not intimate exactly, but close. Deliberate. The timestamp on the photograph read 11 days ago. 11 days ago, while Sterling Wycliffe was making contact with the Pembrokes, and Graham was calling Audrey in direct contradiction of Bennett's instructions, and Audrey herself was sitting on her kitchen floor processing the camera discovery, Bennett had been having dinner with the woman she had never seen. She set the phone down. She picked it up again. She saved the photograph, opened her contacts, and called Graham. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. He answered on the second ring, rough-voiced and not quite awake. "It's midnight, Audrey. Who is the woman?" A pause that went 1 beat too long. "I need you to be more specific," he said, but his voice had already shifted into the careful register. That meant he knew exactly what she was asking and was buying 2 seconds to decide how to answer. "I just received a photograph. Bennett, a restaurant, 11 days ago. A woman I don't recognize. Dark hair, 40s. The line was quiet, Graham. "Where did the photograph come from?" "Blocked number." "I need to know who she is." Another pause. She heard him move the rustle of getting up, a door closing, the specific quality of a man putting space between himself and anyone who might overhear. "Her name is Renata Voss," Graham said. Audrey's hand tightened around the phone. "Voss," she said. "Harlan's sister." She stood up from the kitchen table so fast the chair scraped back. She walked to the window. She needed to be standing. She needed to be looking at something real and external while she processed this, because the alternative was staying seated in a room that was suddenly too small. "Bennett has been meeting with Harlan Voss's sister," she said. "Once that we know of. Once that you know of." Her voice was very controlled. "Graham, you told me Harlan was your primary suspect for the inside source. You told me he came out of the Wycliffe network. And Bennett is meeting privately with his sister 11 days ago, and no one told me." "Bennett didn't tell me about the meeting," Graham said. "I found out afterward." "How?" "Because I have people watching the people who matter," he said. And there was something in his tone, not guilt exactly, but the weight of a man carrying information he hadn't decided how to use yet. "When I found the meeting in my surveillance log, I went to Bennett directly. He told me it was handled and to drop it. And you dropped it. I am currently on the phone with you at midnight, Audrey. Make your own assessment." She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and breathed. Below, the street was empty. "What does handled mean?" she said. "I don't know. He wouldn't say. Is it possible he's running a counter-approach through Renata, using her to feed false information back to Harlan, back to Sterling? It's possible. But he wouldn't tell me to drop it if that were the case. He would have looped me in. Running a counterintelligence operation of that kind through a single meeting with an untested contact it's not how he operates." She understood what Graham was saying underneath the careful phrasing. It didn't make sense as strategy, which meant it might be something else. "Who sent me the photograph?" she said. "Someone who wanted you to see it." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now." Graham's voice was quiet and serious. "The block number is almost certainly routed through a disposable network. I can try to trace it, but the likelihood of getting anything useful before Boston is low." "Boston. 3 weeks. Now 18 days. Bennett is managing something he's not telling you about," she said. "It wasn't a question, yes. And someone in this situation wants me to know that." "Yes. Either to warn me," she said slowly, "or to fracture my trust in Bennett before Boston so that whatever Sterling is planning works more cleanly." "Yes," Graham said, "both are possible. Both may be true simultaneously." She was quiet. "Audrey." His voice came through the phone with something that was the closest Graham Sedgwick got to gentleness. "Don't make any decisions tonight. I'm not making decisions. You sound like you're making decisions. I'm looking out a window. At midnight. Go back to sleep, Graham." She hung up. She stood at the window for another 40 minutes. She did not call Bennett. She confronted him at the estate the next morning. She had slept 3 hours, which was enough to keep the emotional edge off, but not enough to make her feel like a person. And she had spent the drive over deciding on her exact approach, which was direct, non-accusatory until the moment it needed to be accusatory, and absolutely no sentence that started with "how could you?" because that was the kind of question that gave the other person room to redirect. She found him in the kitchen, which was rare. Bennett Ravenscroft did not typically occupy kitchens. He was standing at the counter with coffee and a briefing document, jacket off, shirt sleeves turned up, reading with the concentrated stillness of someone who had been awake for a while. He looked up when she came in. Something crossed his face, not surprise, because Bennett was almost never surprised, but a specific recognition that the conversation he had probably been expecting was about to happen now. Renata Voss, Audrey said. She watched him set the briefing document down. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. He looked at her for a moment, then pulled out the stool across the counter and sat down himself, which was a negotiation, putting himself lower so she could feel the room was level. She noticed it. She appreciated the technique even as she resented it. The photograph was sent to you, he said. Last night. Blocked number. I was expecting that. Her jaw tightened. You were expecting someone to send me a photograph of you secretly with the sister of the man who is feeding information to our primary threat. Not that specific photograph, but something. Sterling has been building pressure from every available direction for 3 weeks. Fracturing your trust in me is an obvious move. Is it working? She said flatly. He held her gaze. You're here asking me directly, instead of making a decision based on incomplete information. So no, don't congratulate yourself yet. She moved to the other side of the counter. She needed something solid between them, not for emotional reasons, but because standing in an open space with Bennett when she was this calibrated was a kind of vulnerability she couldn't afford right now. Tell me about the meeting. He picked up his coffee cup, held it, didn't drink from it. Renata Voss approached me 6 weeks ago. She reached out through a third party, a financial intermediary I've used for legitimate business. She said she had information about her brother's activity and wanted to discuss it. Why would she do that? Because Harlan is going to get her killed, he said, and the flatness of it, the absence of drama in his delivery, made it worse. She knows what he's doing. She knows what Sterling Wycliffe is. She has watched her brother dig himself into a position that has exactly one exit, and it isn't a good one. She came to me because I am the only person in this situation who has both the resources and the motivation to pull Harlan out before Sterling decides he's a liability. Audrey processed that. She's trying to save her brother. Yes, by negotiating with you, by providing me with the specific timeline and operational details of the False Boston plan, he said. In exchange for a path out for Harlan, relocation, documentation, the full package. The kitchen was very quiet. Bennett, she said carefully, if Renata has the details of Sterling's Boston operations, then I have known for 8 days exactly what Sterling is planning. The counter felt very solid under her palms. And you didn't tell me. He set the coffee cup down. I didn't tell Graham. I didn't tell my senior people. I haven't told anyone, because the moment I tell anyone, the operational security of the information becomes a question mark. Renata took significant risk to get that information out. If Sterling finds out she spoke to me before Boston, he'll kill her. And Harlan. She straightened. What is Sterling planning? Bennett looked at her for a long moment, the calculation visible, just barely, at the surface of his composure. The weighing of how much truth to distribute and in what order. Tell me, she said. All of it right now, he told her. It took 11 minutes. By the end of it, she had both hands flat on the counter and was looking at a point approximately 6 inches in front of her face, while her brain processed the shape of what was coming. The waterfront complex outside Boston was a trap. Not in the vague sense of an ambush, but in the specific architectural sense, a facility with controlled access points, communications infrastructure that could be selectively disabled, a security system that Sterling's people had been studying for 4 months. The relocation of the port negotiations from Manhattan had been Sterling's suggestion, introduced through back channels as a neutral site recommendation. Douglas Pembroke had accepted it because Douglas Pembroke was either complicit or being played, and at this point the distinction mattered less than the result. The plan was not to kill anyone. Sterling was smarter than that. The plan was to create a controlled crisis, a lockdown, a separation, a specific window of vulnerability during which Sterling would present Bennett with a choice between surrendering the Ravenscroft network's European assets and losing the one person whose loss he could not absorb. The plan was built entirely around her. He's been watching me for 8 months, she said. Not a question. Yes. Everything you did, the engagement, the apartment, the distance, none of it changed his assessment. No. He never believed you stopped. She stopped. No. Bennett said quietly. She looked up at him. And you knew this when you sent me into the Pembroke engagement dinner. You knew the engagement wasn't protection. You had known for weeks. His jaw tightened. I believe don't. Her voice came out hard. Don't tell me what you believed. Tell me what you knew. You knew Sterling's target was me. You knew the Boston meeting was designed around my presence. You let me negotiate my own terms with Tristan Pembroke and prepare to walk into a building that has been engineered as a trap specifically for you, with me as the mechanism. I have a plan. You have a plan that Renata Voss gave you 8 days ago, and you have told no one. And if something happens to Renata before Boston, then your plan evaporates, and I walk into that facility with nothing but my own instincts and an engagement. Ring I negotiated for myself. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. This is the thing, Bennett. This is the exact thing I have been trying to tell you for months. You make decisions about my safety and my position and my life, and you do not tell me. You protect me by keeping me ignorant, and then you wonder why I don't trust the protection. He was on his feet. She hadn't seen him stand. It had happened in the gap between one sentence and the next, and now he was on the same side of the counter. Not close, not aggressive, just standing in the kitchen with his shoulders set and his eyes on her and the composure finally showing its seams. If I had told you, I would have helped you. You would have been in danger. I am already in danger. You just spent 11 minutes explaining to me exactly how in danger I am. The information didn't create the danger, Bennett. The danger was already there. Telling me about it would have given me the ability to make informed decisions about my own life, which is all I have ever asked of you from the beginning. The kitchen was completely silent. He looked at her. She looked back, and then his phone rang. He glanced at it, a reflex, the immediate assessment of who and how urgent, and she saw his face change. Not dramatically, not the way faces changed in movies. Just a subtle tightening, a recalibration, the specific expression he wore when something had gone wrong in a way that required immediate action. He answered, listened for 20 seconds, hung up. Renata, he said. The single word carried everything. What happened? She's gone. His voice was very controlled. Her apartment, 3 hours ago. Her phone is dead. Her car is still in the garage. The third-party intermediary I used to communicate with her has been unreachable since last night. Audrey's stomach dropped. Sterling found out, she said. Presumably, which means the operational details she gave me may have been compromised. Sterling may know I know, or he may have taken her as a precaution before Boston, without knowing what she told me. He set the phone on the counter. I don't know which scenario I'm operating in. And Harlan, also unreachable. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. If Sterling took her, then he's accelerating the timeline. How much? I don't know. The 3 most dangerous words she'd ever heard him say. Bennett Ravenscroft operated in certainties. He built information networks and contingency plans and layers of operational security specifically so that he never had to say those 3 words. And here he was, standing in his own kitchen at 9 in the morning, saying them to her face. What do we do? She said. He looked at her, not through her, not at the problem around her, at her. The way he looked at her late at night in the study, when no one else was in the building, and he forgot for a few minutes to maintain the architecture of distance. I need to call Graham, he said. Call Graham, and I need you to stay here today. She opened her mouth. Audrey. His voice was quiet and direct. Please, for today, I need to know where you are. She closed her mouth. She sat down on the kitchen stool. Make your calls, she said. What happened next happened in fragments, the way crises always did, not as a single dramatic event, but as a series of small, terrible pieces that only assembled into their full shape in retrospect. Graham arrived at the estate within 40 minutes. He sat across from Bennett in the study while Audrey stayed in the kitchen and told herself she was giving them space, and not that she was sitting very still because movement felt like a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She could hear the tone of the conversation without the words. Graham's voice was measured and low. Bennett's was controlled in the specific way that meant he was managing several things at once and rationing his attention precisely. At some point, a man named Doyle arrived. Audrey knew Doyle peripherally, one of Graham's operational people, compact and quiet, and carrying the specific stillness of someone trained to enter rooms without changing the atmosphere. He and Graham spoke briefly in the hall. Then Doyle left. At 11:30, Bennett came back to the kitchen. "Harlan is in Boston," he said. She looked up. "He checked into a hotel in the waterfront district this morning. Not the facility, a hotel 2 miles from it." Bennett's voice was careful. "That tells me Sterling has already moved people into position. The meeting isn't scheduled for 18 more days, but Sterling is staging now. Is Renata with Harlan? We don't know." She absorbed that. "If Harlan is in Boston and Sterling is staging, then the timeline has moved. Significantly." How significantly? He sat down across from her. She never seen Bennett Ravenscroft simply sit down at a kitchen table without purpose before, without a briefing document, a phone, a specific agenda. He sat across from her like a man who needed, for 60 seconds, to just be in a room with someone he trusted. "I don't know yet," he said. She looked at his face. The exhaustion was fully visible now, not just the seams she'd seen earlier, but the full structure of it, the weeks of carrying the Renata information alone, the months of building distance, while managing the actual threat, the years, possibly, of being the person who held everything in place by sheer force of controlled intelligence and had no one to put it down with. She felt the anger shift. Not dissolve, it was still there, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. And there were conversations ahead of them that were going to be hard and necessary. But underneath the anger was something as older and more complicated. The specific grief of watching someone you love do the wrong things for the right reasons and not knowing how to stop them without losing them. "Bennett," she said. He looked at her. "When Boston happens," she said, "and it is going to happen, and we are going to be in that building, I need you to tell me the plan. All of it. Every contingency. I need to know what I'm walking into. I can't put you in more danger. I am going to be in that building regardless. The only question is whether I'm operating with full information or whether I'm another variable you're managing." She held his gaze. "You said you were going to fix it. All of it. I am telling you right now that fixing it means trusting me with the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, small. The most concession she had ever seen from him. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "Starting now." Starting now. She pulled her chair closer to the table. He started talking. It took the better part of 2 hours. He told her about Renata's original approach, about the intermediary, about the 8 days he'd spent verifying her information against what he already knew through his own channels. He told her about the waterfront complex, the layout, the access points, the communications infrastructure Sterling had been quietly compromising for months. He told her about Graham's contingency operation, the external positioning he'd been arranging in parallel, the people he had placed in Boston 3 weeks ago, who had been watching and waiting. He told her about Sterling Wycliffe, not the organizational version she already knew, the Wycliffe Network's territory, its European connections, its rivalry with Ravenscroft that went back 2 generations. The personal version. Sterling was 44 years old and had taken over his father's organization at 31 after a power struggle that had 2 people dead. And Sterling himself, with a scarred left hand, he always wore a glove over in photographs. He was not impulsive. He did not take risks he hadn't mapped extensively. A Sunteen. He had been planning the Boston operation for the better part of a year, which meant every element of it, including Audrey's presence, had been part of the architecture from the beginning. "He doesn't want the Ravenscroft assets," Audrey said. "He wants me to destroy them." She looked at him. "Explain." "If I surrender the European port contracts and the shipping network to save you, which is what his scenario is designed to produce, it doesn't just give Sterling those assets. It demonstrates to every organization watching that I can be leveraged, that I have a vulnerability that overrides my operational judgment." He paused. "That's worth more than the assets. That's the end of the Ravenscroft organization's credibility in every negotiation it will ever enter." She understood. Sterling didn't want the empire. He wanted the precedent. "So refusing to surrender," she said slowly, "while also not losing me, that's the needle you have to thread." "Yes, which requires me to be an active participant and not a passive hostage." His expression shifted, not reluctance, but something adjacent to it. The specific resistance of a man who understood he was right about something and didn't like being right. Yes, he said. Then tell me what I need to do. They were still talking at 3 in the afternoon when Graham knocked and came in. His face said it before his words did. Douglas Pembroke called the estate, Graham said. He's requesting an urgent meeting. Today. He says the Boston timeline has been moved up and he wants to discuss the implications. Bennett went still. He called here, Bennett said. Not through his people, directly to our main line. He asked for you by name and said to tell you that Tristan agreed it was necessary. Something passed between Bennett and Graham fast, wordless, the shorthand of 15 years. Audrey looked at both of them. What does it mean that Douglas called directly? It means either Douglas is scared and reaching, Graham said, or he's been instructed to create the appearance of reaching. Sterling, she said, possibly, or Douglas has found out about Harlan, Bennett said, and his voice was very quiet, and he is genuinely trying to get ahead of it. She thought about the dinner table. Douglas Pembroke's practiced warmth. Complicated man, the specific way he'd said it. Tristan, she said suddenly. Both men looked at her. Tristan agreed it was necessary. That's what Graham just said. Douglas told you. Tristan agreed. She looked at Bennett. Tristan knows about Harlan. The room was quiet. He found out on his own, she said. Not a question. She was building it as she said it, the pieces arranging themselves. He's been inside his own family long enough to see the shape of what Harlan has been doing. He went to his father. Douglas is now trying to manage the fallout before Boston turns into a disaster that destroys the Pembroke organization. Bennett looked at her. You don't know that, he said. No, she agreed. But it fits. Graham said it fits. Bennett was quiet for 3 seconds. Set the meeting. Tonight here, not at the Pembroke address. Graham left. Audrey looked at Bennett. If Tristan knows about Harlan, she said, and he went to Douglas. Then the engagement was never the problem, Bennett said. The problem was always Harlan. And if we remove Harlan from the equation before Boston, then Sterling loses his inside access. His information pipeline closes. His ability to adjust the operation in real time disappears. Something moved through Bennett's expression, not quite hope, but the focused energy of a man who had just seen the shape of a possible solution. Sterling has been counting on Harlan's positioning inside the Pembroke family to manage the on-site logistics. Take Harlan out and Sterling goes into Boston blind, she said. Partially. Partially blind is better than fully informed. Significantly, she stood up. Her whole body felt the energy of the shift, the way a problem that had been static suddenly became something with momentum, something that could be acted on. The meeting tonight, she said. I'm there. Bennett started to say something. I negotiated the terms of my engagement with Tristan Pembroke. Personally, she said. He agreed to them. I have a working relationship with him that you do not have. If we are going to ask Douglas and Tristan to take action on Harlan before Boston, that conversation goes better with me in the room. He looked at her for a long moment. Then you're in the room. The Pembrokes arrived at 8. Douglas came with one of his people, a man Audrey didn't recognize, older, careful with his eyes. Tristan came alone. He caught Audrey's gaze when he came through the door and held it for exactly 2 seconds, which was enough to communicate that he already knew she knew, and that he was not surprised she was there, and that the situation was exactly as serious as the room felt. They sat in the study. 5 people, the very specific silence that collected in rooms where everyone present understood that the next hour would determine several things at once. Douglas spoke first. I owe this room an explanation, he said. No one contradicted him. Harlan Voss has been employed by my family for 6 years, Douglas said. He spoke carefully, the way men spoke, when they were admitting something that cost them. I was informed 3 days ago by my son that Harlan may have maintained operational loyalty to the Wycliffe network throughout his tenure with us. He has, Bennett said. Douglas absorbed that without flinching. I should have identified it sooner. Yes, Bennett said. Another man might have offered reassurance. Bennett Ravenscroft did not. Where is Harlan now? Graham said. Boston, Tristan said. It was the first thing he'd said. He looked at Graham directly. I've had someone watching him since I confirmed my suspicion 4 days ago. He checked into the Harborside Marriott on Friday. He's been making contact with 3 individuals in the waterfront district. Sterling's staging team, Graham said. That's my read. The room was quiet. Audrey said Tristan. The 3 individuals he's been meeting. Do you have identifications? He looked at her. 2 of them. I need those names. He looked at his father. Douglas nodded once. Tristan reached into his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the desk between them. Graham picked it up, looked at it, passed it to Bennett. Bennett looked at it for 5 seconds, then set it down. That changes the geometry of the operation, he said quietly. How? Audrey said. He looked at her. One of those names, he said, is the facility manager of the waterfront complex. The room went very still. She understood immediately. Sterling didn't just have an inside source in the Pembroke organization. He had an inside source inside the location itself, which meant the lockdown capability, the communications disruption, the controlled crisis. None of it was going to require external force. It was already built in. The facility manager could initiate it from a single workstation with existing infrastructure. He can lock the building from the inside, she said. With complete plausible deniability, Bennett said, a systems failure, an equipment malfunction. Nothing that looks like an assault until the doors are already sealed. She looked at the piece of paper on the desk. She looked at Tristan. When did your person follow Harlan to the meeting with the facility manager? She said. Yesterday afternoon. Which means Sterling knows the timeline has been compromised, she said. Harlan knows he's being watched, which means... She stopped. She looked at Bennett. She watched him reach the same conclusion she had just reached, half a second behind her, which almost never happened. He's not waiting for the meeting, she said. Sterling is not going to wait 18 more days. He's going to move before we can reposition. Before we can? Graham's phone rang. He answered it. He listened for 15 seconds. His face did the thing it only did when something had gone very, very wrong. That was Doyle, he said. He looked at Bennett, the Boston facility. They moved up the meeting. Both organizations have been formally notified. The port negotiations have been rescheduled. He paused. For this Friday. 4 days. The room was absolutely silent. Audrey looked at the piece of paper on the desk, with the 2 names on it. She looked at Bennett, who was looking at the same piece of paper with the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he had time to prepare. She looked at Tristan, who was sitting very still with his hands flat on his knees and his jaw set and his eyes moving between her and Bennett with the particular focus of someone who had just understood that the arrangement he thought he'd made with Audrey was the least complicated thing in 4 days. Nobody moved for about 3 seconds after Graham said it. Then everybody moved at once. Bennett was on his feet, phone in hand, already dialing before his chair had stopped shifting. Graham was at the door, speaking in the low rapid shorthand he used when operational tempo had just jumped 2 categories. Douglas Pembroke stood with the careful deliberateness of an older man who had survived history by never visibly panicking, but his hand went to the back of his chair and gripped it, and that grip said everything. Tristan looked at Audrey. She was already looking at the paper on the desk. The 2 names, the facility manager. She picked it up, folded it, and put it in her jacket pocket before anyone told her to leave it alone. Tristan said nothing about that. 4 days, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Is that enough time to reposition, he said. For Bennett, maybe. She looked up. For Sterling, it's already positioned. That's the point. Tristan understood. She could see it settle across his face. Not fear, something more functional than fear. The recalibration of a man who had grown up in a dangerous world and knew what it felt like when the geometry of a situation stopped being theoretical. Bennett finished his call. He looked at Graham. Something passed between them, the 15-year shorthand, and Graham left the room immediately. We need to clear the estate, Bennett said. He was looking at Douglas. Your people, the man you brought. I need this room to be the 5 of us only. Douglas looked at his man near the door and nodded, barely perceptible. The man left, 5 people. Bennett closed the study door. Here is where we are, he said, and his voice had shifted into the register Audrey recognized from her childhood as the one that meant the situation was serious enough that performance had been suspended entirely. Just the facts. Just the shape of it. Sterling has moved the timeline because he believes we are onto his inside positioning. He's right. He knows Harlan has been compromised as a silent asset, and he is accelerating before we can use that knowledge to restructure the meeting. Can we cancel Boston? Douglas said. No. Bennett said it without hesitation. If we cancel, Sterling reads it as confirmation that we have his operational details. He disappears, restructures, comes back in 6 months with a plan we can't see. The only viable path is to walk into that building. Into a trap, Douglas said. Into a trap we know the shape of. That distinction matters a great deal less once the doors are sealed, Douglas said. Which is why the doors are not going to seal, Bennett said. He looked at Douglas steadily. But I need something from your family to make that true. Douglas waited. Harlan cannot be in that building, Bennett said. The room was quiet. You're asking me to remove my own security chief 4 days before a major negotiation, Douglas said. I'm asking you to remove Sterling Wycliffe's asset from a position where he can initiate a lockdown that will result in the destruction of both our organizations and the probable death of several people in that building. Bennett's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. That is what I am asking. Douglas looked at his son. Tristan said, Do it, Dad. Something moved across Douglas Pembroke's face, the complicated expression of a man hearing his son take a position with that specific authority for the first time, and registering that the authority was not misplaced. If Harlan disappears 4 days before Boston, Sterling will know, Douglas said. Yes, Bennett said, but he won't know what we know about the facility manager. He'll assume we burned Harlan through Pembroke-side surveillance. He'll think his internal communications pipeline is closed, but his facility asset is still intact. He paused. He'll walk into Boston believing he still has the building. And he won't, Audrey said. Everyone looked at her. She looked at the pocket where she'd put the paper. The facility manager. His name is on that list. We have 4 days to get someone into that building in a position to counteract whatever access Sterling has given him. That's not a 4-day operation. Graham said from the doorway he had come back in, quiet as always, and was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed. No, Bennett said, but we don't need to replace the access. We need to be able to override it from a secondary system. He looked at Graham. The facility has a backup communications and security infrastructure, physically isolated from the primary network. Graham said, We'd need someone inside who knows the building. I know the building, Tristan said. Everyone looked at him. A sound like green, he looked back with the calm of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say the thing. My family has used that facility for 3 previous meetings. I have walked every corridor, every utility access, every stairwell. I know where the secondary systems are physically housed. He looked at Bennett directly. Tell me what you need me to do. Bennett looked at Tristan for a moment. Audrey watched Bennett decide something she could see it. The careful reassessment, the recategorization of Tristan Pembroke from a variable to be managed into something else entirely. Tomorrow morning, Bennett said, you and Graham. Every detail of the layout you can remember. Tristan nodded. And Audrey, Bennett said. She looked at him. You don't go into that building without knowing the full contingency, he said. Tonight. All of it. I know, she said. I mean all of it, he said, and the way he said it told her there was more than what he'd given her this afternoon. More layers, more contingencies, more of the architecture he'd been building quietly for months. Tonight, she said. They worked until 2 a.m. Friday came the way bad things always came with the specific cruelty of ordinary-looking weather. Clear sky, cold, the particular gray-blue light of a New England morning that had no opinion about what was happening underneath it. The drive to Boston took just under 4 hours. Audrey rode with Tristan in the Pembroke car because the optics required it, which meant 4 hours in a black SUV with Tristan's driver in the front and the 2 of them in the back with the privacy partition up and the specific silence of 2 people who had negotiated a paper marriage and were now driving toward a building designed as a trap. An hour outside the city, Tristan said, "How are you doing?" "Fine," she said. You don't have to do that. She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the highway median. I'm scared, she said, and I'm focused, both at the same time. That's the right combination, he said. Have you been in situations like this before? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Situations with this specific shape? No. Situations where I walked into a room knowing someone in it wanted to use me as leverage. A few times. He looked at her. It gets easier to breathe through if you give yourself one thing to focus on. What's yours today? Making sure Harlan's removal doesn't get traced back to me before we're inside. He said it simply, without drama. My father had him picked up this morning. Medical emergency. Family matter. The cover story is clean. But if Sterling has a contact inside the Pembroke organization who notices the gap, he'll adjust, she said. He'll adjust, Tristan agreed. She looked out the window. What's yours? He said. She thought about it. The financial records, she said. He looked at her. She had not told Tristan about the financial records. She had not told anyone except Bennett last night at 1 a.m. when he had finally laid out the last layer of the contingency, and she had understood what her specific role in the building was going to be. It wasn't to be rescued. It was to finish it. Don't worry about it, she said. Tristan looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the window. You know what I think is interesting about you? Tell me. You grew up inside Bennett Ravenscroft's house, inside his organization, his logic, his way of reading a room. And instead of becoming dependent on it, you became fluent in it. He paused. That's not common. I didn't have a lot of other options. Lots of people don't have options, and they still become dependent. He looked at her. You became capable instead. That's a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. She didn't answer immediately. Then, you're surprisingly decent, Tristan. Don't let it get around. She almost smiled. The city appeared on the horizon. She stopped, almost smiling. The waterfront complex was exactly as Bennett had described it. 3-story structure, gray stone and glass, positioned on a private pier with controlled vehicle access and a single public-facing entrance that required keycard clearance past the lobby. The kind of facility that legitimate organizations used for high-security negotiations and that illegitimate organizations used for exactly the same purpose, with the additional benefit of plausible deniability if something went wrong. Both organizations arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Bennett came with Graham and 2 others she recognized from the estate. He was in a dark suit, complete composure, the full performance of a man who was exactly where he expected to be, and had no concerns about it. He moved through the lobby check-in with the specific ease of someone who had decided that whatever fear he was carrying was irrelevant to the next several hours. He caught her eye when the groups converged in the lobby. A look fast and complete. She gave him the smallest nod. He looked away. Sterling Wycliffe arrived at noon. She had not seen Sterling before in person. She had seen photographs, the gloved left hand, the gray at his temples, the particular kind of handsome that came from money and the willingness to do whatever money required. In person, he was quieter than she'd expected. Not small, he was tall, well-built, the physical ease of someone who had never had to be afraid of a room. But quiet, contained. He shook Douglas Pembroke's hand. Then Bennett's. When he reached Audrey, he paused for exactly 1 beat before extending his hand. Audrey Whitcomb, he said. His voice was pleasant. Conversational, like they were at a garden party. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Likewise, she said. Her hand was completely steady. She was proud of it. Something moved through his eyes, a quick assessment, clinical and thorough, the look of a man cataloging information. Then he moved on. She breathed. The negotiation session opened at 1 o'clock in the main conference room on the 2nd floor. Long table, 8 chairs per side, windows facing the harbor. The kind of room that was designed to feel neutral and managed to feel the opposite. Audrey took her seat beside Tristan on the Pembroke side. Bennett was directly across the table. Sterling was at the far end, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize, and one she did a compact, watchful figure she had seen in photographs from Graham's intelligence files. A man named Cole, who was Sterling's operational director and the person most likely responsible for the facility arrangements. She did not look at Cole for longer than a natural glance. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She waited. The preliminary session lasted 90 minutes. Port contracts, transit windows, revenue structures, liability frameworks. The legitimate surface of the meeting, moving at the careful tempo of people who understood they were establishing a record. Sterling's team was precise and well prepared. Douglas Pembroke's people were more cautious, choosing their words with the additional care of men who were aware that something was wrong, but not certain when it was going to show itself. Bennett said very little. He spoke when spoken to, offered specific and limited responses, and spent the rest of the time in the particular stillness that Audrey knew meant he was tracking everything simultaneously. She spent the 90 minutes watching Cole. Cole spent 10 minutes of it watching her. At 2:47, the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a surge, just an immediate, complete darkness, the kind that meant it was not a circuit breaker, but a deliberate system cut. The backup lighting activated within 4 seconds, the red-tinted emergency strips along the floor, giving the room the specific quality of somewhere underground. Before anyone spoke, the door locks engaged. The sound was unmistakable. 8 separate bolts, simultaneous, the magnetic seals engaging with a collective sound like something being closed permanently. Then the phone stopped working. Audrey looked at her screen. No signal. Not reduced zero, the specific zero of active jamming, not infrastructure failure. 3 things in under 10 seconds. Sterling had been patient for 8 months. He was not patient anymore. Sterling stood up. "I apologize for the interruption," he said pleasantly, as though the lights and the locks and the dead phones were a minor inconvenience he felt responsible for addressing. "This will only take a few minutes." Douglas was on his feet. "What is sit down, Douglas?" Still pleasant, still conversational. "You're in no danger. This is a business matter." He looked across the table. Directly at Bennett, between old friends. Bennett sat completely still. "I have a proposal," Sterling said, "a simpler one than the agreement currently on the table. Mr. Ravenscroft will transfer controlling interest in the European port contracts and the associated shipping network infrastructure to the Wycliffe organization. In exchange, everyone in this room goes home tonight, and Audrey Whitcomb's continued well-being remains exactly what it has been, up to this point." The room was silent. "You have 20 minutes to decide," Sterling said. He sat back down. Audrey looked at Bennett. Bennett's eyes moved to her briefly, 1 second, and she saw something she had never seen in his face before. Not fear, not calculation. The expression of a man confronting the exact moment he had spent months trying to prevent, discovering that preventing it had not been possible, and deciding in real time what the next 5 minutes were going to look like. He looked away from her. He looked at Sterling. "You've been watching Audrey for 8 months, Bennett said. His voice was completely level. "You know everything about her living arrangements, her security, her engagement. You believe that she is the one pressure point that overrides my operational judgment." He paused. "I'd like to ask you something." Sterling waited. "How many floors is the building's secondary security infrastructure housed on?" Something changed in Sterling's face. A microshift, fast and immediately controlled. "That's not relevant to, because I'm told it's basement level," Bennett said. "Isolated physical network, separate power supply, emergency override capability built into the original construction. The kind of redundancy that a thorough facility manager would know about." He tilted his head very slightly. A thorough facility manager who had not, in fact, come to work today. Cole moved. It was a small movement, a shift in his chair. A hand moving towards something, but Graham was already standing. And the 2 men Bennett had brought were already positioned, and the whole geometry of the room changed in the span of 2 seconds. Sterling looked at Cole. Cole looked at Sterling. "The facility manager," Sterling said, very quietly, "is in federal custody as of 6 this morning," Bennett said. "Financial fraud charges. It took some work to surface the connection between his holding company and the Wycliffe organization's shell structure, but once we had the thread, it moved quickly." He paused. "The secondary system is currently accessible. And in approximately 6 minutes, if I don't send a specific text message to a specific number, My people outside this building are going to activate it, and every door in this facility is going to open. Sterling stared at him. You don't have people outside, he said. I have 11 people outside, Bennett said. I have had them in Boston since Monday. 3 of them know the building well enough to find the secondary access point from the exterior utility corridor without a keycard. He looked at Sterling steadily. You accelerated the timeline because you believed we had burned Harlan. You were right. What you didn't know is that we burned him 8 days ago, which gave us time to do everything else. The room was very quiet. Audrey kept her hands flat on the table. She could feel Tristan beside her completely still, breathing controlled, the presence of a man holding position. This doesn't change the fundamental equation, Sterling said. And his voice had shed the pleasantness now, just the flat, direct voice of a man who had spent 40 years surviving by not being moved. You can open the doors. You can bring your people in. But Audrey is still in this room, and I still have 4 men in this building, and whatever happens in the next 20 minutes costs you something you cannot replace. Bennett said nothing, because Sterling was right, and they both knew it, and the room knew it, and Audrey could feel the truth of it pressing against the surface of the moment like water against glass. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She put a USB drive on the table. Everyone looked at it. That drive, she said, and her voice came out level and clear. Contains financial records connecting the Wycliffe organization to 16 counts of Port Authority bribery, 31 shell company transactions that constitute money laundering and federal and documentation of 4 separate extortion arrangements with licensed shipping contractors operating in the New England corridor. She looked at Sterling. I've been building that file for 3 weeks. Using records I accessed through my position as Tristan Pembroke's representative and through financial databases, I know how to navigate because I grew up watching the man across this table build the most legally careful criminal organization on the East Coast. Sterling looked at the drive. He looked at her. If something happens to me in this building, she said, that file reaches 3 federal investigators, 2 investigative journalists, and a federal prosecutor who has been looking for a Wycliffe entry point for 6 years. She kept her voice completely steady. That's not a threat. It's the current state of affairs. You can factor it into your calculation or not, but it doesn't change whether it's true. Sterling was very still. You built that, he said. Not a question, not quite. In 3 weeks, she said. With publicly available records and access I was given legitimately. Imagine what I can do with more time. The silence in the room was the kind that meant everyone was doing math simultaneously, and nobody liked the answers they were getting. Sterling looked at Bennett. You brought her here, he said. She herself, Bennett said. And there was something in his voice that the room could hear, something that was not performance and not strategy and not the controlled delivery of a man managing an outcome. Just the plain voice of a man saying a plain true thing. She has been making her own decisions for some time now. I have been trying to keep up. Sterling looked at the drive on the table. He looked at Audrey. He looked at the door. The door's open in 4 minutes, whether you decide anything or not, Bennett said. Your men outside this table are looking at Graham and 2 people who are significantly more prepared for the next 4 minutes than they are. And in 6 minutes, assuming I don't send that text, the secondary system activates and every exit in this building unlocks from the outside. Sterling said nothing. Here is what I'm offering, Bennett said. You walk out of this building today. The drive stays with Audrey. The federal referral does not happen. The Wycliffe organization's existing port arrangements remain intact. He paused. You absorb the loss of the European expansion, and you rebuild on what you have. And if I don't accept, then the next 4 minutes get complicated for everyone, and the drive goes out regardless. Sterling looked at the table. He looked at Cole. Cole looked at the floor. Sterling said, The Ravenscroft girl built this file herself. Her name is Audrey Whitcomb, Bennett said, and the edge in his voice on that sentence was the first thing approaching emotion he had allowed into the room. And yes, she did. Sterling was quiet for a long time. Outside the harbor windows, the water moved. The backup lighting hummed along the floor. Somewhere in the building, the ventilation system moved air through ducts that had been installed. When the place was built 20 years ago, before anyone had imagined that a 22-year-old woman with 3 weeks and legitimate database access could dismantle the financial architecture of an organization that had taken 8 months to plan a trap for her. Sterling stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Audrey one more time, the same clinical assessment he had given her in the lobby, but something was different in it now. Not respect, not quite. Something more like recalibration. The look of a man updating a model. "You should have been in the room from the beginning," he said. "I know," she said. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the magnetic seal. 4 seconds later, the doors opened. Sterling Wycliffe walked out of the room. Cole followed. The other 2 men followed Cole, and then the room was just the people who were supposed to be in it: Bennett and Graham and Tristan and Douglas and Audrey and the backup lighting and the harbor outside and the specific silence that collected in spaces where something enormous had just stopped moving. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Douglas Pembroke sat back down, heavily, the controlled posture of 63 years, finally giving way to something more human, and put both hands on the table and exhaled. Tristan looked at Audrey. She looked back. "The file is real," he said. "Not a question. Every document," she said. "If he checks, he'll find everything I said he'll find," she said. "I didn't bluff anything. I don't know how to bluff anything. I documented what was documentable, and I made sure it was enough." Tristan was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks, he said. "I had a good teacher," she said. She looked across the table. Bennett was looking at her. He had been looking at her, she realized, since the moment she had put the drive on the table. That particular stillness that was not composure and not calculation, but something much older and much less managed than either of those things. The look of a man who had spent years constructing elaborate protection around a person and had just taught that person protect herself with tools she had built entirely inside his orbit, using everything she had absorbed from him, and was now reckoning with what that meant. She held his gaze. She did not look away. Graham's phone buzzed. He looked at it, looked at Bennett. "Doyle says Sterling's vehicles have cleared the perimeter." Bennett broke the eye contact. "Tell him to hold position until we have confirmation. Sterling is out of the waterfront district." Graham stepped out. Douglas was talking to Tristan. In a low voice, something about next steps, about the port agreement, about the legal exposure of the Wycliffe financial documentation, and what Audrey planned to do with it going forward. Audrey stood up. She picked up the USB drive from the table. She walked to the window. The harbor was gray and cold and completely indifferent, the way water always was, moving because that was what it did, regardless of what was happening on the land beside it. She could see one of Bennett's people on the exterior walkway, a position she now recognized from his description of the 11-person perimeter. A man who had been standing in the Boston cold since Monday, waiting for the signal that might or might not come. She heard Bennett come to stand beside her. Not close. A foot of space between them, but beside. "The facility manager," she said. "Did you actually get him this morning?" "Arrested at 6:03, he said. "And the federal fraud charges?" "Real. Graham has been building that file for 3 weeks in parallel with yours." A pause. "We didn't know you were building one." She looked at her reflection in the glass. "I didn't tell you," she said, "because I needed something that was mine, that I had done, that didn't come from your resources or your network or your people." She paused. "I needed to know I could." He was quiet. "Could you?" he said. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, but she heard it. Audrey said. "Don't," she said. "Not here. Not yet." She looked at the harbor. "There are still things that need to happen. The federal referral, the Wycliffe documentation, the port agreement that Douglas and Tristan still need to finalize without Sterling's interference." She straightened. "Let's finish the work." He said nothing for a moment. "Then all right." She turned from the window. The room was still full of people with things to do, and she was one of them, and Sterling Wycliffe was somewhere on the road back to wherever he had come from, and the drive was in her pocket, and the doors were open. And every piece of the architecture that had been closing in on her for months was standing in this moment before its final collapse. and the only thing left was to watch it. The port agreement took 4 hours to finalize. Not because the terms were complicated, the framework had been mostly intact before Sterling walked into the building, but because Douglas Pembroke needed the time. Not legally, not strategically, personally. A sat-at team. He sat that conference table after Sterling's vehicles cleared the perimeter, and he worked through every clause with the specific thoroughness of a man who needed to do something methodical to hold himself together, and nobody rushed him, because everyone in the room understood what thoroughness looked like when it was doing double duty. Tristan sat beside his father for all 4 hours. He didn't say much. He read the documents when they were passed to him, offered 2 specific amendments that Bennett's people accepted without argument, and kept his hand on the table close enough to his father's that Douglas twice reached over and briefly gripped it. Tristan let him. He didn't make anything of it. Just let it be what it was. Audrey watched that from across the table and felt something move through her that she didn't try to name. Bennett worked the far end of the room with Graham and the 2 attorneys who had been brought in from the external perimeter. His jacket was off for the first time all day. He had rolled his sleeves up at some point in the second hour. He looked like what he was, a man who had been running at full operational capacity for weeks and was still running, would keep running until every piece was in place, because that was the only speed he knew. She looked at him when he wasn't looking at her. She did that for a while. At 7 in the evening, Douglas signed. Tristan signed. Bennett signed. The European port agreement between the Ravenscroft and Pembroke organizations was formally concluded without Sterling Wycliffe's participation, his objection, or his presence on the same continent of relevance. Graham opened a bottle of something and poured it into glasses that the facility's catering staff had left behind before the lockdown and nobody had thought to remove. It was not a celebration exactly. It was more the specific exhale of people who had been holding their breath for a long time and had been given permission to stop. Douglas Pembroke, 3 glasses into whatever Graham had poured, looked across the table at Audrey and said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "I allowed a man into my organization whose loyalties I should have verified more carefully," he said. "And I allowed the situation that followed to put you at risk. That is a failure of judgment that I intend to account for." She held his gaze. "I appreciate that. I mean it specifically," he said. "Not as a formality." "I know," she said. "I can tell." He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who had said the thing and meant it, and was at peace with having said it. Tristan, beside his father, looked at Audrey with the quiet expression that she had come to understand over the past weeks was his actual face, the one underneath, the practiced social ease, the one that appeared when he wasn't performing for anyone. "The engagement," he said. She looked at him. "Formally dissolved," he said. "With my complete support and none of my family's objection." He paused. "The commercial agreement stands on its own terms." That was always the part that mattered. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Tristan." He shook his head slightly. "Thank you," he said, "for negotiating terms that gave both of us room to actually be decent people." She almost smiled. "Don't push it," she said. He did smile. Small, genuine, the smile of a man who had been called out twice now with the same phrase and found it fair both times. They drove back to New York that night. Audrey rode with Bennett. She had not planned to. She had intended to take one of the other vehicles, Graham's or the second Ravenscroft car, and serve herself the 4 hours of road to process everything, before she had to face the conversation she knew was coming. She had intended that very specifically. She got into Bennett's car. She didn't examine the decision. Graham drove. Bennett sat beside her in the back, jacket folded across his knee, looking out the window at the highway entering the city's dark periphery. Neither of them spoke for the first hour. The silence was not uncomfortable. A sound. It was the particular silence of 2 people who had been through something significant together and were both respecting the weight of it before they tried to put words to it. Outside, Massachusetts dissolved into Connecticut. She watched the median lines in the headlights. "The federal referral," she said eventually. Graham forwarded the documentation package to the U.S. Attorney's office at 517, Bennett said. "Including both files, mine and yours. How long before they act on it?" "Weeks. Maybe longer. Federal timelines are not negotiable." He paused. But once the referral is in, Sterling can't undo it. He can manage it, contest it, delay it. He can't make it not exist. She nodded. His financial infrastructure is already compromised, Bennett said. The partners connected to the bribery documentation will distance themselves before the week is out. That's not optimism. That's how that world works. When the exposure becomes credible, proximity becomes liability. He'll survive it, she said. Not with bitterness. Just accurately. Probably, Bennett said, reduced. Isolated. Without the European expansion, he spent a year engineering. He looked out the window. That's the realistic version. It's enough, she said. He looked at her. It's enough, she said again. He doesn't get to win. Doesn't get to have what he built this year. That's sufficient. I'm not in the business of destruction for its own sake. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said quietly. You're not. Connecticut moved past the windows. Graham dropped Bennett at the estate and Audrey at her apartment without being asked to. He read the room accurately, as Graham always did, and made no comment about the arrangement. She stood on the sidewalk outside her building at 11:15 at night, with her jacket still carrying the faint traces of a very long day, and looked up at the 7th floor. The lights were off. She went up. She made tea she didn't particularly want, because the process of making it gave her something to do with her hands, while her brain slowly released the compression of the last 12 hours. Sits. She stood at her kitchen counter and waited for the kettle and looked at the cabinet where she had found the first disabled camera 3 weeks ago. She thought about Bennett purchasing this building 14 months ago, upgrading the elevator security, redesigning the emergency exits, installing the cameras and then disabling them the day she moved in because he knew she'd find them, and he wanted her to have the privacy she'd earned. She thought about garlic-free Thai food at 9:30 on a Thursday. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the conference table when she put the drive down. That specific expression, not pride exactly, because pride implied he had been responsible for what she'd done, and he hadn't been. Something else. Something that had more to do with being seen than being impressed. She poured the tea. She sat down at the kitchen table. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a while. Then she set it down without dialing. Not yet. There were things that needed time. Not distance, she was done with distance as a survival mechanism. Done with it for both of them, but time. The real kind. The kind that let the dust settle before you tried to see what the landscape actually looked like. She drank her tea. She went to sleep at midnight for the first time in weeks without the knot behind her sternum. 3 days passed. She used them. She called the attorney she had been working with on the financial documentation and walked through the federal submission in detail, making sure every piece of the evidentiary chain was intact and properly attributed. She called Tristan twice once about the formal engagement dissolution, and once unexpectedly about a specific clause in the port agreement that she had a question about, and they talked for 40 minutes about logistics and European Port Authority regulations, and she realized somewhere in the middle of it that she was enjoying the conversation, which was not something she had anticipated when she negotiated herself into this arrangement. She went for runs, the long kind, the kind where she let her body do the work while her mind sorted through everything she'd been carrying. She called Margaret. The photograph, she said when Margaret answered. By the bathroom window. Is it still there? A pause. It's been in your room since you left it. I'd like to have it, Audrey said. She heard something in the silence that followed, not quite surprise, but the emotional equivalent of a door that had been closed for a while being reopened. I'll have it sent over, Margaret said. I'll come get it, Audrey said. Tomorrow morning, if that's all right. Another pause. The kitchen will be open, Margaret said. She arrived at the estate at 9. Margaret met her at the side entrance, not the formal entrance, the one Audrey had always used, because it was the one she'd known since she was 8 years old, and old habits were old habits. Margaret handed her the photograph wrapped in a cloth, looked at her face for a moment with the assessment of a woman who had watched this girl grow up inside walls that were not always safe, and said, "You look better." "I am better," Audrey said. "Good." Margaret turned back toward the kitchen. "Coffee's on." She sat in the kitchen for a while, with the photograph on the table in front of her. Her mother, mid-30s, standing in a house somewhere in Virginia that Audrey had no other memory of, laughing at something outside the frame. The photograph was old enough that the color had shifted the greens to yellow. The sky slightly flat, but her mother's expression was completely alive, completely present, the expression of a woman in the middle of being happy. Audrey looked at it for a long time. She heard him come into the kitchen. She didn't turn around. She heard him pour a mug of coffee, the specific sound of his pour, unhurried, the same as it had always been, and then he sat down across from her at the table. He looked at the photograph. She was funny, he said. Your mother. Sharp. The kind of funny that caught you off guard. Audrey looked at him. You've never told me that. No. He held his mug with both hands, the way he only did when he was not performing anything. I should have told you more about her. I had years to and I kept thinking there would be a better time. There's always a better time until there isn't, she said. Yes. He looked at the photograph. Her name was Caroline, and she hated winter, and she once told me that the only way to know if a person was genuinely trustworthy was to watch how they behaved when they thought no one was looking. He paused. She would have found the camera situation extremely ironic. Audrey's mouth curved despite herself. She would have said something devastating about it. Without question. They sat in the kitchen with light coming through the tall windows, and the coffee going slowly cold between them, and the silence was the kind that had something real in it. Not the managed silence of two people maintaining distance, but the silence of two people sitting close enough to the truth that they didn't need to fill it. Bennett, she said. He looked at her. I need to say some things, she said. And I need you to let me say them completely before you respond. He set his mug down. All right, he said. She looked at the table for a moment. Organizing. You spent 2 years building something between us that you never named, she said. And then, when it became a liability, when loving me became a target on my back, you dismantled it by being cruel to me. You told me I was a bargaining chip. You told me I needed to make myself useful. You did it because you believed that making me hate you was the fastest way to make me safe. She paused. And I understand why. I have understood why since Graham told me about the camera shutdown, since I found the building records, since Boston. I understand the logic. I understand that in your world, love has always been a vulnerability to be managed. He was completely still. But here's what you have to understand, she said. I was 8 years old when I came to this house. I spent 14 years learning to read rooms, learning to be composed, learning to hold position when the people around me were falling apart, because I understood from very early on that this house required a certain kind of person to survive in it. She looked up at him. I became that person. I am that person. And for 2 years, I allowed myself to believe that the thing between us was real enough to be worth being vulnerable about, which is something I do not do easily, and which cost me something significant when you dismantled it. His jaw tightened. He didn't look away. I am not angry anymore, she said. I was angry. For weeks I was angry in a way that made it hard to be in the same room as you without wanting to say something that would leave a mark. But the anger is gone now, and what's under it is, she stopped. Reset. What I need you to hear is this. The cruelty you used to protect me caused real damage. Not the kind that heals clean, the kind that leaves scar tissue. And I am not willing to pretend otherwise, or to absorb it as the cost of being loved by someone like you. The kitchen was very quiet. You understand that, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. His voice was low and completely direct. I understand it. Say what you actually did, she said. Not the strategy, not the logic. What you actually did. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not the controlled shift she was used to, not the managed recalibration. Something that came from deeper than his composure and had clearly been there for a long time, waiting for, precisely, this permission. I told you that you were a bargaining chip, he said. When you asked me if any of it was real, and I confirmed that it was, and then told you to go to Manhattan anyway. I used your trust against you. I made you doubt your own experience of what was between us because it served my operational purpose, and I did it knowing exactly how much it would cost you to hear it. He paused. I spent your pain like a currency I'd decided had a good enough exchange rate. The sentence sat in the room like something finally laid down after a very long carry. And I am sorry for it, he said, not as a strategy. Not as the preamble to asking you for something. I am sorry because it was wrong, and it caused you harm, and there is no version of my logic that makes that acceptable. She breathed. She had not known she needed to hear him say it like that plainly, without architecture, until she did. She said, "That's not absolution," he said. "I know that." "No," she agreed. "It's a beginning." He looked at his mug. "The building," he said. "I know about the building," she said. "I know you know. I want to explain it." He looked up. "Not justify it. Explain." He was quiet for a moment. "I bought it because I needed to know where you would be. Because the Wycliffe threat was already forming, and I could see the shape of it, and I could not." He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, something raw at the edge of it. "I could not have you out of my reach, without knowing I had done everything I was capable of doing to make the perimeter safe." "You could have told me," she said. "You would have refused to live there." "Probably," she said. "Which is the point. You made a decision about my life that bypassed my ability to consent to it." "Yes," he said, "I did. And the cameras. I disabled them because you deserved the privacy, and because by the time you moved in, I understood that monitoring you without your knowledge was not protection anymore. It was control. And I had been telling myself those were the same thing for so long that I had stopped examining the distinction." She looked at him. "You knew the difference," she said. "You knew it when you disabled them." "Yes," he said. "It was too late by then to be the right choice. It was just the less wrong one." She picked up her coffee mug. It was cold. She held it anyway. "I need to tell you something," Bennett said. She waited. "I have been in love with you," he said. "Since you were 19 years old and you walked into a meeting I was having with two men who were substantially more powerful than you, and you sat down without being invited and asked a question that neither of them could answer." He said it with the specific flatness of a man reporting a fact that had shaped the last 3 years of his life and was only now being reported to the person it concerned. "I spent a year telling myself it was inappropriate and irresponsible and a category error. Then I spent another year telling myself I had it under control. And then the Wycliffe surveillance began. And I understood that I had never had it under control, and that the most dangerous thing I had ever done in my entire professional life was fall in love with someone I would tear the world apart for." The kitchen light moved with a cloud outside the window. "I handled it badly," he said. "I handled everything badly except the parts that were purely logistical. The feelings, the honesty, the being a person with you, instead of a structure. I failed at those things repeatedly, and I caused you real harm in the failing." She was quiet. "I am not asking you to forgive it immediately," he said. "I am not asking you for anything. I wanted to say it without the context of a crisis or a trap or a strategy. Just the plain truth in a kitchen, in the morning." He looked at her directly. "I love you. I have loved you for 3 years. And I am sorry it took me this long to say it to your face without a wall behind it." Audrey looked at the photograph of her mother on the table, at the woman laughing at something outside the frame. She thought about being 8 years old in this house. She thought about 14 years of dinners and arguments and late nights and grief and the particular education of growing up inside an empire and coming out the other side of it knowing how to hold position in rooms that were designed to make you small. She thought about Bennett Ravenscroft purchasing a building 14 months ago and installing cameras and disabling every single one of them the day she moved in. She thought about garlic. She picked up the photograph. She stood up. She crossed to his side of the table. She put the photograph down in front of him. "My mother believed," she said, "that the only way to know if someone was genuinely trustworthy was to watch how they behaved when they thought no one was looking." She looked at him. "The cameras were off, Bennett. You thought no one was looking." He looked at the photograph. He looked up at her. She held his gaze. "Earn it," she said, "not with logistics, not with buildings or contingency plans or 12 layers of operational security. Earn it the way ordinary people earn it." She paused. "Show up, tell the truth, ask before you decide. Start there." He was quiet. "That's all you want," he said. "It's not a small amount," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at the photograph of her mother for another moment. "But it's not impossible." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She picked up the photograph. She walked back to her side of the table. She sat down. She picked up her cold coffee. "Tell me more about her," she said. "The things you never told me." He looked at her. Something in him, some last remaining architecture of distance, came quietly down. He picked up his own mug. He started talking. 3 months passed the way months did after something large, with the specific quality of ordinary time that felt slightly different in texture than ordinary time had felt before, as if the same hours were carrying a different weight. Audrey moved to a different apartment. Her own lease, her own name, a building Bennett did not own. She told him specifically which building it was, and which floor, and which unit, and he listened without comment, and she appreciated the listening. It was on the Upper West Side with good light and a kitchen that didn't have a history and a view of a park where she ran 3 mornings a week. To build. She built the life she had needed to build. She took a position with a legitimate financial consulting firm that worked with shipping and logistics companies, a field she knew better than she had any conventional reason to, having absorbed it through years of proximity to people who operated inside it. She was good at the work, better than good. Her supervisor told her after her second month that she had an instinct for seeing the structural vulnerabilities in financial arrangements that most people needed years to develop. She thanked him without explaining how she'd developed it. She saw Tristan twice in those 3 months. Once at a Pembroke business event she attended as a professional contact, where they had a brief and genuinely pleasant conversation about the European port arrangement, and he told her, with the matter-of-fact directness she had come to appreciate, that his family's position had stabilized significantly since Boston. Once for coffee, spontaneously, after running into each other near the park, where they talked for an hour about nothing operational, and she discovered that Tristan Pembroke, stripped of the strategic context of an arranged engagement, was actually a reasonably interesting person with a genuine sense of humor and a brother in Portland he called every Sunday without fail. The Wycliffe investigation moved through federal channels at the speed federal channels moved. Sterling retained counsel and contested several aspects of the financial documentation, which was expected. The bribery charges were the strongest 6 of the 16 counts reached the indictment stage by the end of the second month. Sterling's partner organizations began the predicted withdrawal. His European expansion was formally abandoned by the 3rd month when the 2 shipping contractors central to the port scheme terminated their agreements, citing legal exposure. Sterling Wycliffe was reduced, not destroyed. Audrey had said that was enough. She held to it. Bennett dismantled the illegal infrastructure of the Ravenscroft organization over the course of those 3 months. Not quickly, not cleanly. Nothing that large or deeply embedded was ever dismantled quickly or cleanly, and anyone who claimed otherwise had never actually done it. A sound like greenwood splitting, it was slow and expensive and required navigating the specific human problem of telling people who had built their livelihoods inside a particular structure that the structure was changing, and they would need to change with it or find somewhere else to be. Some people found somewhere else. Most of them adapted. The shipping and logistics operations were reorganized under legitimate holding companies with proper licensing and compliance infrastructure. The real estate arm was restructured with a new board and an external auditor Bennett brought in specifically because the auditor had a reputation for finding things that people preferred she didn't find. The investment side took the longest 6 weeks of legal review and document restructuring that Graham supervised, with the precision of a man who understood that the difference between legitimate and illegitimate was often a matter of paperwork and patience. Graham, during this period, was quietly remarkable. Audrey told him so once, on the phone, and he was silent for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "Don't make it strange," he said finally. "I'm not making it strange," she said. "I'm being honest. Those are not mutually exclusive," he said, but she could hear something underneath it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, including the midnight phone calls." Another pause. "Then you're welcome, Audrey." She let him hang up first. Bennett came to the Upper West Side apartment on a Sunday morning in early winter. He had called ahead, which was new. He had asked if it was all right, which was newer still. She had said yes and made coffee and was reading something at the kitchen table when he arrived. He came in, looked around the apartment with the assessing attention of a man who noted details, and said nothing about the building or the security or any of the things she had been half expecting him to say. He sat down at the table. She poured him coffee. They sat outscening. They sat together in the Sunday morning light that came through the kitchen windows of a building he didn't own, in an apartment that belonged entirely to her, and they talked the way they had learned, over 3 months, to talk honestly, specifically, with the things that needed to be said actually said, and the things that needed time actually given time. He told her about the restructuring, the specific difficulties of it, not the managed version he would have given to a room full of people, but the actual version the people who had resisted, the legal complications that had taken longer than he'd planned, the 2 weeks in the middle where he had genuinely not been certain it was going to hold together. She told him about her work. The financial consulting, the specific project she was currently 3 weeks into, the colleague who had questioned one of her analyses in a staff meeting and turned out to be right, which she had found more satisfying than irritating because being right all the time had always seemed to her like a sign that you weren't working with people who were good enough to catch your mistakes. He listened to all of it, not patiently, in the way of someone waiting for their turn genuinely, tracking the details, asking questions that demonstrated he had heard the previous sentence and the one before it. She had asked for this. Show up, tell the truth. Ask before you decide. He was doing it. It was not a small amount. He was not failing at it. They went for a walk after coffee. The park she ran in was 2 blocks east. Sunday mornings it had the specific population of a city park in winter dog walkers, a few runners, an older man who appeared every week with a bag of bread, and a philosophical relationship with the pigeons, a pair of small children, navigating a frozen puddle with the intense focus of people for whom this was the most important project currently underway. They walked without particular direction. The cold was clean and dry. The trees were bare, the light flat and pale, the city operating at its Sunday register quieter, less urgent, the particular frequency of a place that was still very much itself, but had agreed collectively to breathe for one day. Bennett put his hands in his jacket pockets. She put her hands in her coat pockets. They walked side by side in the cold with 4 inches of space between them and said very little for a while, and the silence was good. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped, started again. Are you all right? Not operationally. Not about Boston or the Wycliffes or the restructuring. He looked at her. Are you all right? She looked at the path ahead. Yes, she said. Not immediately. She gave it the weight it deserved before she turned it over, checked it against her actual experience of the last 3 months. I have work I'm good at and a place that's mine, and she paused. I'm building something. It feels like mine. That's new. It should have been available to you sooner, he said. Yes, she said simply. It should have. He accepted that without defense. I'm proud of you, he said, for what it's worth for me right now. She looked at him. It's worth something, she said honestly. It's not worth everything, but it's worth something. He nodded. They kept walking. The small children had successfully crossed the frozen puddle and were now apparently debating whether to cross it again. Bennett, she said. Yeah. I don't want to go back to what we were, she said. Before. The thing we had that we never named, and that operated entirely around your management of it. No, he said immediately. I don't want that either. I want something different, she said. Something with the naming in it. The honest version, she looked at him. I don't know exactly what shape it takes yet. I think we need to find that out, as it happens rather than engineering it in advance. He looked at her with that expression, the one she had been seeing more of in these 3 months, the one that lived underneath the architecture of his composure, and was, she had come to understand, the most truthful face he had. That is the opposite of how I have operated for my entire adult life, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm asking you to do it. He was quiet for a moment. I can do that, he said. I know you can, she said. You've been doing it. He looked at the park around them, the winter trees, the pale light, the children who had decided, apparently, to cross the puddle a 3rd time. I love you, he said. still with that particular flatness, the reporting of a fact rather than the performance of a feeling. She had come to understand that this was how he said things that mattered, without the ornamentation, just the plain word, placed directly. She looked at him. She thought about 14 years. She thought about the morning she had walked out of his study with her shoulders level and her chin up, having been told she was a bargaining chip, a sound like green wood sling, and had carried that out of the stairs and into her bedroom, and had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her own hands and tried to figure out how to survive it. She thought about building a financial dossier in 3 weeks from a kitchen table in an apartment she hadn't yet decorated, but because she'd been too busy documenting the infrastructure of a criminal network. She thought about putting a USB drive on a conference table in Boston while 4 of Sterling Wycliffe's men were in the room. She thought about the question her mother had lived by. How people behaved when they thought no one was looking. The cameras had been off. She had been looking. She knew what she'd seen. "I know," she said. "I know you do." She took her hand out of her coat pocket. She put it in the 4 inches of space between them. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took his right hand out of his jacket pocket and put it around hers. Warm, steady, unhurried, they walked. The park moved around them. The pale light held. The older man with his bread had apparently reached an agreement with the pigeons and was reading a newspaper on a bench. The children had abandoned the puddle and moved on to a more ambitious project near the tree line. Neither Bennett nor Audrey said anything for a while. There was not much left that needed saying, and both of them understood that what had not yet been said could wait. Not because it wasn't important, but because the walk, the cold, the hand in the hand, the Sunday morning that belonged to no agenda and no strategy and no threat that needed managing. This was the thing that had been missing from both of them for a very long time, and they were in no hurry to move through it. They walked until the cold drove them back toward the coffee and the kitchen and the apartment that had good light. She unlocked the door. She went in first. He came in behind her and closed the door, and the warmth of the apartment the outside, and the quiet of it replaced the open space of the park. And it was still Sunday, and there was nowhere that either of them needed to be. She put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table. Outside the window, the park was still there, the pale winter light still holding, the city going about its Sunday life in its Sunday register. Everything that had needed to happen had happened. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without the specific permanent marks that real things left on the people they moved through. But it had happened. It was done. She put 2 mugs on the counter. She waited for the water to boil. Behind her, in the warm kitchen of the apartment that was entirely hers, Bennett Ravenscroft sat at the table and said nothing, and asked for nothing, and managed nothing, and waited simply for her to be ready. She was